Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Zintis Hermansons. I work as a project expert at ESPON EGTC. I'm dealing with 5-6 projects, and it's a pleasure to see you. Some of you I know very well. So my task today is briefly present the ESPON policy brief on labor migration challenges in Europe, and also links to functional areas. And you can download the policy brief at the ESPON website or fetch a copy outside, hard copy. What I also want to say as an introduction is that this policy brief was prepared together with the Romanian presidency. It actually was requested by the Romanian presidency, so we worked on this together. And what a policy brief does, it's not a major research. It's just a synthesis of the research findings from the previous actually ongoing ESPON projects. And what I'll try to do, I'll look at some of the current trends in terms of labor migration, and then also talk about some policy options and policy recommendations. And you might probably know that's the usual business of the day, that in these policy briefs we try to kind of synthesize and be more to the point and not expand the research. So if I start by the current trends, the ESPON Employ project, which is actually finished, came up with a very simple methodology how to look at the migration. And they defined all regions as either sending or receive regions, meaning that regions with a negative net migration rate were defined as sending, and regions with positive migration rate was defined as receiving regions. It's a very simple approach, but it gives you instantly the picture, right? And in the policy brief, we're playing with these green and red colors. So you can see that, obviously, the picture is not surprising, but there are these small pockets in some side of some of the countries, which kind of, leads us to some further questions why it is so. I injected on purpose something which is not in a policy brief, but just to mention it, is that obviously migration happens because of various reasons, not only about people seeking better employment opportunities. And it's sometimes hard to distinguish why people migrate, right? So here I try to picture the employment rate of EU citizens residing in other countries. And you can see that in receiving regions, employment rate of citizens of other EU member states is generally higher than in the sending regions. So that's also something to think about when we're analyzing the labor migration and the link is just migration for different kind of reasons. Now we're approaching to the topic, functional areas. Here we have a map on metropolitan regions. And as you know, in statistical terms, we know metropolitan regions as approximations of functional urban areas at NUTS 3 regional scale. And it's important to mention metropolitan regions because, as the OECD research shows, migrants are more likely to be employed in mostly metropolitan regions than other types of regions. And that, I think, you can clearly see in the map that there are not big differences with the slides I showed previously. However, the fastest outward flows of migrants tended to be recorded in some of the metropolitan regions, mostly affected by the financial and actually economic crisis. Continuing with the trends, we also looked at the shrinking cities, and this was something mentioned already at the beginning by Tim and others, because when we talk about the functional approach and functional urban areas, it seems that the things are happening there, but it's actually not the case. We also have functional areas at the urban scale which are shrinking. And this is actually the key map in the policy brief. I worked on it for quite some long time because obviously there are some data challenges. And what we found out is that, in fact, one out of every 5 cities in Europe has faced population losses since 1990. The shrinkage is not similar in all cities. There are continuously shrinking cities. There are cities with episodical shrinkage. There are cities which are temporarily shrinking. And obviously, in many cases, the shrinkage is due to labor migration. We also looked at inner peripheries. Some of you may know that we had a project called ESPON Prophecy, which developed a typology of inner peripheries in Europe. So they tried to delineate inner peripheries, looking at different types of inner peripheries, and they come up with 5 typologies. And when you look at the labor migration in these inner peripheries, then you can also see a similar picture, meaning that peripheralization can be one of the factors which provoke labor migration in descending regions. So one part is current trends, and then what we try to do in the policy brief, we try to look at some policy options. So what to do about labor migration, how to reverse it or attract labor force and migrants. So one option is to build a knowledge economy, and this concept also comes from one of the ESPON projects, ESPON Employ project. And by knowledge economy, we understand economy which is based on innovation and highly skilled labor force. And here the map, I have a migration and knowledge economy combined. And as you may notice that out-migration in sending regions, so mostly in South and in East, correlates with lower levels of human resources in science and technology. So highly skilled migrants migrate towards areas with higher standards of living and where the knowledge economy is more developed. And that is obviously because in these knowledge economy regions, human capital could be offered more satisfactory returns in terms of salary and etc. The project also looked at some different types of knowledge economies, and there are regions which are highly competitive, and there are regions which are less competitive. But the point is here to say that even in descending regions, where they have less competitive knowledge economy, it's still possible to work on it and kind of catch up with the rest of the regions in the developed part of Europe. Another option is look at diaspora strategies, and it's kind of also functional in a way. I think you have seen the remittance mapping, the global remittance mapping, how the remittance flows from abroad back to countries, and obviously that's also one way how to look at it, and you can work on some strategies which look at the taxation, which are directed towards social security, and obviously something which is quite important to people is organizing events like diaspora conferences, or you can have measures which actually target people and ask them, kind of incentivize them to come back, not only stay and contribute from abroad. Another option is to work on attractiveness, and we had a project called ESPON Migrare project, which is still ongoing, which developed a typology of regions in terms of attractiveness, and they synthesized many indicators to come up with a typology, and this is basically kind of a way to say that there are different factors influencing attractiveness, and regions can look which factors are more pronounced, which are not, and then come up with appropriate measures. Another approach we know very well is, of course, promotion of functional approach in planning and governance, which is mentioned also by our director Ilona, and we had a very prominent project called ESPON SPIMA project, which looked at it. And I also want to use the chance to mention ESPON Fuore project, and Roger is going to talk about it. And it's very important because, as it was mentioned by one colleague, we also lack statistics and solid understanding of the trends in functional urban areas and functional regions. So this project is mainly addressing this. So Roger will explain more what exactly we are doing there. Now the policy recommendations, something more specific, not just an option. When it comes to knowledge economy, the ESPON Employ project developed 5 kind of ways how to address how to build the knowledge economy, And what they proposed is to look at monetary and non-monetary incentives to develop OASIS strategy, meaning that supporting knowledge economy sectors with the highest potential given the existing competences. Then also perhaps to build a magnet strategy, so exploiting some unique territorial resources and aspects which are not seen elsewhere. Then something maybe quite straightforward, building knowledge economy opportunities through urban development, and also branding of regions, branding of cities, and so on. And then also there were some suggestions also for diaspora. In fact, we have 2 case studies in the policy brief, looking at Italy and actually Romania, where you can read more about what exactly was done in these countries. So when it comes to improving attractiveness, there was an ESPON project in the previous program called ATREG, which looked at the attractiveness. Some of you may remember it. And what they did, they specifically talked about what they called mobilization strategy, that we need actors and stakeholders to come together to mobilize resources and work on a strategy which specifically addresses attractiveness factors. So that could be through, of course, some governance frameworks, and also to capacity building and so on. And at the end, we conclude with a functional approach in planning, and that was also quite a lot discussed in the ESPON SPIMA project and in some other policy briefs. And there we have three broad strands, through policy and legislation, through funding, and through capacity building. So when we look at the policy and legislation, we emphasize the need to intensify policy coordination and discussion on the issues related to functional cooperation areas and different cooperation areas. And that is why we have also 2 parallel sessions looking at cross-border regions and macro regions where it's the same basically story, it's just the scale is different. Then at the national level, to establish an overarching policy framework and guidance to enhance the involvement of regional and local authorities in cooperative governments and planning initiatives at various functional scales. Now, when it comes to funding at EU level, I think it was already mentioned, there are many instruments which could potentially be applied, and one of them was called ET, Integrated Territorial Investments. So need to work on new instruments and tools, and perhaps at national level to allocate financial incentives to support networking, cooperation, and linkages among municipalities. And then, of course, at the end, it's a capacity building, and there we also have a recommendation to address, I think it was also mentioned by Tim and others, it's this need to really address functional areas cooperation in research more than it's perhaps done now. So this was a brief overview of what we did in a policy brief. So very welcome to download it and read it. Thank you.